Good evening, everyone. Now, we are about to start our program, but before we do, we have something extra special to do this evening. And not everybody may know we're going to do this, but Richard, who is on the panel, has brought with him a signed Stephen King book. Yes. And he has generously offered to give it to one of you. So, everybody who bought a ticket had their name painstakingly cut out and put into this bag. I promise you, everyone. And I'm going to have Richard reach in and call a name, and that person's going to get an amazing gift. Are we ready? Here we go. You can reach in. You just pick any name. Good luck.
Brittany Grasser.
Brittany Grasser, are you here? You bought a ticket, Brittany Grasser. Well, that was one of the problems with our theory. Well, that's all right. That's all right. Last chance. Brittany Grasser going once, twice. All right, we get to draw again. I'm sorry. If you know Brittany Grasser, well, we you know, it's got to go to somebody in person. All right. Here we go. For the Stephen King book. Are we ready?
Rick Bender.
Rick Bender? Yes, there he is, Rick Bender! Richard, you may present the book.
Thank you. Enjoy.
And that's awesome. Thank you so much. I am now going to hand the mic over to our host for the evening, Kiana.
All right. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 12th annual Harrisburg Book Festival. As we already heard, my name is Kiana, and I am the events assistant here at the Midtown Scholar. Thank you for joining us here in Harrisburg. We're so happy that you're here, and we hope that you enjoy tonight's event as we celebrate 50 years of Stephen King with Richard Chizmar, C.J. Leede, Catriona Ward, and Chuck Wendig. Before we get started with our program, we have some quick housekeeping notes. As mentioned, this is the 12th annual Harrisburg Book Festival. We have many events coming up over the next few days, including our outdoor tent sale with over 30,000 books, Children's Day programs, a wall with our beautifully hand-decorated blind date with a book selection, a dog adoption event, and much more. Please take a festival brochure with you as you leave, and check out our website at hbgbookfest.com, and stay tuned to our social media pages. Second, the Harrisburg Book Festival would not be possible without the support and enthusiasm of our sponsors. We have many sponsors. Please check them out on our website and give them lots of love. But I'd like to highlight one special sponsor tonight, and that is Horror on Main. Horror on Main is a woman-owned weekend convention on adaptation horror that bridges media types by having horror actors who have starred in films based on books, comics, or games, and are potentially authors themselves, alongside having authors who have had their work adapted into films, comics, and games. Their upcoming convention will take place from June 27th to June 29th, 2025. Please visit their website at horroronmain.com for the full details. And please, let's give them a big ol' round of applause. All right, and lastly, just a reminder that we will be having a book signing with all authors on stage this evening in our Rare Books building next door. We have copies of all of their spine-chilling books available at the cafe, so we encourage you to come away with just a few more books before you leave tonight and get them signed. We want to continue this festival for at least another 12 years, and book sales are a huge part of what allows us to do that. So we thank you in advance for all of your support. Now, it is my honor to introduce our speakers. Richard Chizmar is the co-author with Stephen King of the New York Times best-selling novella Gwendy's Button Box and Gwendy's Final Task, and the solo novella Gwendy's Magic Feather. Recent books include the New York Times bestsellers Becoming the Boogeyman and Chasing the Boogeyman, and Widow's Point, a chilling tale about a haunted lighthouse co-written with his son, Billy Chizmar, which was recently made into a feature film. Chizmar's work has been translated into more than 15 languages throughout the world. Richard's new book is titled Memorials, and we did receive special permission from the publisher to sell the book at this event 2 whole weeks before publication, which means that right now, this is the only place that you can get a copy. C.J. Leede is a horror writer, hiker, and Trekkie. She is the author of Maeve Fly and American Rapture. Her debut novel, Maeve Fly, won the Golden Poppy Octavia E. Butler Award and Splatterpunk Award, and earned a Bram Stoker Award nomination. When she is not driving around the country, CJ can be found in LA with her boyfriend and rescue dogs. American Rapture is CJ's newest book, and like Richard, we received special permission from the publisher to sell it at this event, as it's not out until next week. Chuck Wendig is the New York Times best-selling author of Black River Orchard, Wanderers, The Book of Accidents, and Wayward, and over 24 other books for adults and young adults. A finalist for the Astounding Award and an alum of the Sundance Screenwriters Lab, he has also written comics, games, and for film and television. He lives in Bucks County, Pennsylvania with his family. Catriona Ward was born in Washington, D.C., and grew up in the United States, Kenya, Madagascar, Yemen, and Morocco. She studied English at the University of Oxford and later earned her master's degree in creative writing at the University of East Anglia. Ward is a 3-time winner of the August Derleth Award for Best Horror Novel. For The Girl from Raw Blood, her debut, Little Eve, and The Last House on Needless Street. Little Eve also won the Shirley Jackson Award for Best Novel. Ward is the international best-selling author of The Last House on Needless Street and Sundial. It is an honor to host Catriona, Chuck, Richard, and CJ here in Harrisburg. But first, a reading from Stephen King's first published novel, Carrie, from the Lebanon Valley College's Associate Professor of English and Creative Writing and author of Heading North, Holly Went.
It was time to teach them a lesson, time to show them a thing or two. She giggled hysterically. It was one of Mama's pet phrases. Mama coming home, putting her purse down, eyeglasses flashing. Well, I guess I showed that a thing or two at the shop today. There was the sprinkler system. She could turn it on easily. She giggled again and got up, began to walk barefoot back toward the lobby doors. Turn on the sprinkler system and close all the doors. Look in and let them see her looking in, watching and laughing while the shower ruined their dresses and their hairdos and took the shine off their shoes. Her only regret was that it couldn't be blood. The lobby was empty. She paused halfway up the stairs and flex. All the doors slammed shut under the concentrated force she directed at them, the pneumatic door closers snapping off. She heard some of them scream, and it was music, sweet soul music. For a moment, nothing changed, and then she could feel them pushing against the doors, wanting them to open. The pressure was negligible. They were trapped. Trapped. And the word echoed intoxicatingly in her mind. They were under her thumb, in her power. Power. What a word that was. She went the rest of the way up and looked in, and George Dawson was smashed up against the glass, struggling, pushing, his face distorted with effort. There were others behind him, and they all looked like fish in an aquarium. She glanced up, and yes, there were the sprinkler pipes with their tiny nozzles like metal daisies. The pipes went through small holes in the green cinder block wall. There were a great many inside, she remembered. Fire laws or something. Fire laws. In a flash, her mind recalled thick black cords like snakes, the power cords strung all over the stage. They were out of the audience's sight, hidden by the footlights, but she had had to step carefully over them to get to the throne. Tommy had been holding her arm. Fire and water. She reached up with her mind, felt the pipes, traced them. Cold, full of water. She tasted iron in her mouth, cold, wet metal, the taste of water drunk from the nozzle of a garden hose. Flex. For a moment, nothing happened. Then they began to back away from the doors, looking around. She walked to the small oblong of glass in the middle door and looked inside. It was raining in the gym. Carrie began to smile. She hadn't gotten all of them, only some, but she found that by looking up at the sprinkler system with her eyes, she could trace its course more easily with her mind. She began to turn on more of the nozzles, and more, yet it wasn't enough. They weren't crying yet, so it wasn't enough. Hurt them, then hurt them. There was a boy up on stage by Tommy, gesturing wildly and shouting something. As she watched, he climbed down and ran toward the rock band's equipment. He caught hold of one of the microphone stands and was transfixed. Carrie watched, amazed, as his body went through a nearly motionless dance of electricity. His feet shuffled in the water, his hair stood up in spikes, and his mouth jerked open like the mouth of a fish. He looked funny. She began to laugh. By Christ, then, let them all look funny. And in a sudden blind thrust, she yanked at all the power she could feel. Some of the lights puffed out. There was a dazzling flash somewhere as a live power cord hit a puddle of water. There were dull thumps in her mind as circuit breakers went into hopeless operation. The boy who had been holding the mic stand fell over one of his amps, and there was an explosion of purple sparks, and then the crepe bunting that faced the stage was burning. Just below the thrones, a live 220-volt electricity cable was crackling on the floor, and beside it, Rhonda Simard was doing a crazed puppet dance in her green tulle formal. Its full skirt suddenly blazed into flame, and she fell forward, still jerking. It might have been at that moment that Carrie went over the edge. She leaned against the doors, her heart pumping wildly, yet her body as cold as ice cubes. Her face was livid, but dull red fever spots stood on each cheek. Her head throbbed thickly, and conscious thought was lost. She reeled away from the doors, still holding them shut, doing it without thought or plan. Inside, the fire was brightening, and she realized dimly that the mural must have caught fire. She collapsed on the top step and put her head down on her knees, trying to slow her breathing. They were trying to get out the doors again, but she held them shut easily. That alone was no strain. Some obscure sense told her that a few were getting out the fire doors, but let them. She would get them later. She would get all of them, every last one.
How's everybody doing?
Yeah.
Good. I'm good. How's all these people doing? Yeah. This is
How
exciting.
good was Holly? That was amazing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was great.
So we're going to talk Stephen King tonight, right? Thanks, everybody, for coming out, first of all. Look at the pub.
It's a big crowd. Thank you, guys.
So I'm going to kind of lead it off a little bit and give you guys the floor first. I'm curious. This is not a question that I'm supposed to ask, but I want to know for myself. What was your first Stephen King?
Ooh, my first Stephen King, The Shining, was my first. Probably not the one that like stuck with me, but it was my first.
Misery.
It.
Mine was Salem's Lot. Yeah. So what's your favorite?
Well, I have such a love for actually his female-led narratives. So Dolores Claiborne is a real favorite of mine. I think it's fantastically well observed and so visceral. And he's so good at writing women, and that particular relationship between those two women is I just found mesmerizing. So I think that's my favorite.
I would say, piggybacking on that, Lisey's story is like a very underappreciated book, in my opinion. I think that and The Shining, for me, because they're both books about like the ways in which writing and being a creative person can maybe even negatively impact people in your life, and that sort of anxiety of living with this need to create, but also like all of the repercussions being that type of creative person might bring.
I think like the most impactful for me was probably The Stand early on, but and it kind of informed my writing and the way I read, and it's such a big, chunky, chewy book. But I think my personal favorite is Misery. Man, that is a tight book. That's just one of those like just a sweet, trashy nightmare of a book. And the movie is great too, but really misses some of the grislier brutality found in the pages
Somehow.
of that. Yeah.
And
So
even
good.
just that, like, the single copy of a manuscript existing is such a fucking
That's a horror
horrific
story.
That's the true horror. Yeah.
Yeah.
For writers now, it's an extra different kind of horror.
Yeah.
Man.
But we were talking about this earlier, weren't we? Also, like, I've got such a soft spot for, like, your favorites change, don't they?
Yeah, for
like,
sure.
Mine has never changed.
Has it
But go ahead.
What is it?
Go ahead. I want to hear.
I was just going to say, when I first read Duma Key, I wasn't quite persuaded, but I read it again last year, and I was like, this is a masterpiece. It's amazing.
No, that I agree with.
Yeah.
As far as your opinion on various books, just not my favorite. My favorite's It. Always has been It.
Yeah.
But going back to you guys, I mean, Misery. Don't you think that could almost have been a Bachman book?
Yeah, I can see that. And it feels like he's in conversation with himself too, a little bit.
Yeah.
Which kind of has that Bachman vibe.
Absolutely. And then Lisey's story, I know people who loathe Lisey's story. I know people who hate the language, who hate the baby talk and all that
crazy.
stuff. I really liked it. And it's interesting because it's one of the books I've talked to Stephen about a lot. And I was interested in exactly, like people ask me about Chasing the Boogeyman. I kind of, that was my approach with Steve is, all right, how much of this is true? Does Tabby hate when you do this? Does she, because I've known Stephen for 35 years. I'm still scared to death of Tabby. I think, he might be too. But it's just interesting because he has a really warm spot in his heart for that book.
Well, it's about that relationship
Yeah, exactly.
and the person who's sort of like your number one.
Yeah, it's an homage to someone who's, put up with your expletive deleted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
years
what
on
would
end.
happen if you weren't there with them anymore and you
Right.
just kind of left them with this thing? I mean, it's really,
Being
really
a
great
writer's
book.
hard,
Everybody
but
read
being
that.
with a writer is,
Yeah.
I mean, that's something else.
Thank you to our partners.
Yeah, thank you to our partners.
So how much do you feel like King's work has influenced your own work?
I mean, I think it's in the DNA, isn't it, of all horror these days anyway. I mean, I don't think you can talk about horror without talking about Stephen King. I also think it for me, it was the first like properly modern 20th century horror that I'd read when I was about 12, and it transformed the world because it shows that horror has such a place for being gothic and 19th century and those kind of older discussions, but to read for the first time this kind of, it's almost like hyper realistic very like modern realism couched in terms of these horror sort of images and metaphors. He's a realist hiding inside of a horror writer's skin, which is a very horror image in itself. But yeah, I mean, I think it's hard. It's a bit like saying I was about to be very hyperbolic and say how does the Bible influence you, but it's so built in to what one perceives as horror that it's really hard to untangle that thread, I think.
I think for me, it was like much more intentional. I was in my early 20s and I was in a writing program and I kept handing in stories and a professor said, "These are horror stories." And I was like, "No, they're not. I don't read horror." And he said, "These are horror stories." And I went and read Misery and then The Shining. And I was like, holy shit, this is what I want to do. And these are horror stories. So that was like my mid-20s. And ever since, I've been kind of like systematically, I've been going through and getting an education. And I have to say, it's been the most fun ever. It's been awesome.
Yeah, I don't know that you can disentangle Stephen King from my work, probably all our work. I don't know that we necessarily get to be up here without that. It's not to say that he invented horror fiction, but certainly the horror genre has been shaped around him. I mean, in the sense that he's an eye of a hurricane, and it all kind of moves around his work early on. And I think for me personally, one of the kind of lessons that I took from him, and one of the things that I thought was very amazing that he can do and that he has done again and again is like when you're an author, and I think we can probably all speak to this a little bit, you get this question, which is like, well, what's your brand? What's your platform? And you're like, I don't know. And I was always like, well, a brand is the thing they put on a sheep to keep it in the fence, man. Like, so, like I was like, I don't have a brand. But then, like, you kind of look at Stephen King, and like that is true. As much as we're like, well, he's the horror genre, but he's also not. I mean, he's written some bizarre fantasy stuff, and he's written this great science fiction. And the brand is Stephen King, right? You look at this guy, and you always know when you pick up one of his books, it's a Stephen King novel. Start to finish, it feels like him. Snout to tail, it feels like he wrote this book. And yeah, he has some hallmarks and some sort of literary pieces that always kind of go with it and that string them all together. But even books that are different still vibe like Stephen King. And I think that was one of the things that really gave me a little bit of freedom to be like, well, I don't think my next book has to be like the book that came before it. And I don't think the third book needs to be like the former two books. There was just a great freedom in sort of seeing that, you can really break the mold, and the goal is maybe to be your own brand as much as a brand is anything at all.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, who did he say brought horror out of the castles for him? Was it Matheson?
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, and for me, that was like, because I grew up on Twilight Zone and those type of things, and I loved them. Tales from the Crypt, but these weren't stories about people I knew. And then, I read Salem's Lot. I grew up in a small town. I read Christine, and I'm like, I know all these people. I know everyone in this book, and there's big parts of me in this book, and for me that was a revelation. And for me, it's interesting because I'm not sure which one of you said it. I think it was CJ. It's like, this is what I want to do, and that was the overwhelming reaction from me. Even though I was too young to know better. I mean, before that, I just wanted to be a professional baseball player, and all of a sudden, I'm no longer aiming for that, and I want to write, which is, pretty much just as crazy when you're like 12 years old, But yeah, it's just interesting because, again, you have those conversations with other writers, and some of them, at least some of the ones I've talked to, they kind of go out of their way. They kind of bend themselves into pretzels to say, no, Steve's work has not affected me in any way, and
avoiding the dirty H word.
Yeah,
oh, yeah,
yeah, and although I don't think they would mind, the blurb on the front of the book,
right,
from Steve or from their publisher saying in the tradition of Steve. But yeah, it's just interesting because any way you look at it, he's the 800-pound gorilla. And yeah, I mean, to me, my response is always just, man, if you're going out of your way to kind of, shun that influence and that exposure to all of his work, I'm like, man, you're missing out.
I agree.
Yeah.
It is. It's a missing out. Like I know like everybody else and their mother grew up with it, but like because I came to it late, even coming to it as an adult, there is such like a comfort feeling in Stephen King books. Like there's such like, because at their heart, there's always like friendship, and there's always like
There's an order to the universe.
there's an order to the universe. Yeah.
And a
it's
dead
so
kid,
special.
probably.
Yeah,
Probably.
many. I did that. I did a creative writing master's program, and they workshop you every week, and you give 5,000 words in, and it's very, very literary, very, very, very high. Like it's a bit like the Iowa Writers Workshop. It's like the equivalent of that. And every week when I was workshopped, I was writing a Victorian ghost story, which eventually became The Girl from Raw Blood. And every week, we never got past, in this 2-hour workshop. First of all, the rules are you're not allowed to talk while anyone else is workshopping you. So you sit there for 2 hours, like scribbling notes like this, and like going through the 7 stages of bargaining and grief and anger. We never really got beyond the question of whether I was allowed to be there at all. Like, that was the main discussion every week that I was workshopped. I think things have got better now. I think horror is having, the aperture has opened up a little bit. I think the eye of the needle is larger than it was, and I think horror is getting the respect and appreciation it really deserves. But it was extraordinary. I was like, I can't be sitting here again for a year, sitting here for 2 hours just watching you like argue about, because you're writing something that you consider like hardcore realist fiction, that whether I should be allowed to be here because what I'm doing is a genre you don't consider on a level. It's like that review that you always get in the newspapers. Whenever a literary writer turns their hand to horror, the review always goes, "They truly transcend the genre."
Genre's sticky though, because like when I had my first book out, Blackbirds, it came out and I wrote a horror crime novel about a girl who can see how you're going to die when she touches you. And then the publisher was like, urban fantasy. And I was like, whoop, oh, okay, but there's no urban or fantasy. And they were like, yeah, but that's what we're calling it. And so that's how it went out on shelves. Yeah. And then another publisher picked it up after that publisher went insolvent, and I got my rights back. And then Simon & Schuster picked it up. And they were like, oh, yeah. So I'm like, so we're not going to call it urban fantasy now? And they're like, no, definitely not. I'm like, cool. So like, what is horror, right? We're going to call it horror. They're like, we are going to identify it the same genre as Joe Hill writes. I'm like, horror. And they're like, no, supernatural suspense. We don't call things horror. I was like, Joe Hill? Joe Hill does not write horror. They're like, nope. I was like, ah. So it's really nice to see horror come back. And I do love the transformation that King has had over the course of sort of American culture in his career. This sort of idea that initially he writes kind of trash pop culture garbage, and they didn't like that he used brands, and he talked about Coca-Cola in his book. How dare you? But now it's like he has transcended the genre.
Yes, indeed.
And he's like kind of an American treasure and an American classic, and literarily he's kind of attained that level of respect, and that's I think notable.
So I'm going to get you guys to air some of your dirty laundry in relation to in relation to Stephen King. Do you have any that have taken a while to grow on you, or still haven't? Or I'm always intrigued when you get on social media, and I'm always intrigued to read when someone poses that question and to read the varied answers. And I mean, there are people out there who, don't like Salem's Lot, and I'm just wondering, are you crazy? And then, I had to be dragged kicking and screaming to read the Dark Tower books.
Yeah, it was Gunslinger for me. I tried reading that like 5 or 6 times, and I was like, what is happening in this book? And I had read It and Sand and Shining and Misery, and then I was like reading this one. I was like, no. What is no?
So
and
you
then
never,
there was
never made it further?
I would try it like every couple years, and then one time I had graduated college, and I just read it in one sitting, and I was like, oh, and then moved on to the next book, and then once the second book hit, it was just like I was in, and I was hooked, and it's one of the most amazing series, and I love it.
Yeah.
I'm nervous to answer this one.
That's why I asked.
All right, today's the day I'm canceled from the genre and everything else. It's been nice knowing you. So, I don't really totally believe in, a concept of, capital G good and capital E evil. And so any books that are kind of about... You can
kind of tell that from your books, by the way.
Like the good versus bad, like The Stand, like The Dark Tower. I don't know. I like the ones that are about like a flawed, maybe messed up person or alien clown, you know, who's maybe just hungry and just needs to eat. I like that ambiguity, but I will say, for the record, every Stephen King book is perfect. And by the way, some of the Bachman books that get a bad rap are actually some of the best, I think. Like The Long Walk is like
The best.
just like
So
a
good.
perfect book. It's just it's like the original Squid Games. What happens if you can't stop walking, or like you're gonna die? I've
Like
walked
speed,
pretty
but
far.
really slow.
Yeah, it's a speed but really slow.
I had trouble with the Tommyknockers. I had trouble. I think maybe because there was such a lot of physical suffering in the book as well, which I think came after. There was a terrible car crash she was in, and I think that book was very much involved in this sort of terrible physical and emotional recovery. It's the book itself isn't the problem. It's just I can't bear reading it. I also I go back and forth on Rose Madder. Like, I love that. I just think there's too many italics. Almost all of it's in italics. The book itself, I think, is fantastic. I think the concept's fantastic, but I don't know. I love it. I hate it. I love it. I hate it. It's my.
No, I agree. Rose Madder is one of those books where, and it's been a while since I've read it, so I'm due for a revisit. But it's one of those books when I finished it, I enjoyed it, but I had no desire to go back and read it again. And Carrie was like that for years for me.
Right.
Like, more of the film. I don't need to ever see Carrie again.
Right.
Just because it's so good and it's so disturbing and it's stuck in my, I grew up as a Catholic, so, my goodness, I don't want to see that again.
You have an internalized Carrie.
Yeah. Just to put, one of his strengths obviously is putting you in the character's clothes.
Yeah.
And I grew up with 3 older sisters, so that movie messed me up in that regard too, where it's just like, you mess with my sister, I will burn the gym down myself. But what did you guys think of Insomnia? Because that's a book that gets a bad rap, and I love it. I
loved that book.
I love when Steve writes about older people, the elderly, because this sounds weird, but I was the youngest of 5, and there's like 10 years between me and 4, so clearly I was a mistake. So I had older parents, so I kind of saw the world a little bit through their eyes, and I just feel like Steve nails it anytime he's writing about somebody old. And the intriguing thing for me, which I've tried to learn from as a writer, because, man, I just ride down that nostalgia slide all day long, and to a fault. But he doesn't do that. He'll make one of his older characters just the meanest son of a bitch or the most conniving, and then just like real life, and then there's the guy who's saying, "Hey, get off my lawn," but inside he's a softie, But yeah, Insomnia. That's a book I return to. You guys talked about comfort reading, and I enjoyed the Dark Tower series, but I'm not going to return that for comfort. Do you guys remember where you were when you read certain Stephen King books, like in your life, like they marked the passage of time for you? Yeah,
absolutely.
And I don't do that with other authors. It's interesting. So I don't know.
Maybe Ursula Le Guin or someone like that. That's a similar, but that's probably the only one. Yeah.
Yeah, I remember reading it, being like roughly the age, 12, 13 years old, and reading it. And you're like, whoa, this is some real shit here. For like middle grade fiction, kind of wasn't really a thing. And I was like, this is my middle grade fiction. It's fine. It's all good.
It's fine.
And weirdly, like my kid's now 13. And he has middle grade fiction and loved it and read it a lot. And then one day he was like, "Oh, I'm going to read one of your Stephen King books." I'm like, "Oh, which one are you going to read?" And ironically, it was Gunslinger. And he was his first one he read. He read it again in like 2 sittings. I was like, "That was great." I was like, "God damn it. How dare you?"
I haven't read Insomnia, but as far as older characters, some of those hospice scenes in Doctor Sleep.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Oh man, that book.
Is it the cat that knows when you're going to die?
Yeah. I think that book's very special. I think there is something about Stephen King, and this is what I think like all of us get to do, and why the genre rocks so much is like we live with this thing that is death all the time, and there is something about like putting it in the room with us and kind of like really acknowledging it and really looking at it and being like, hey, it's here, that actually I think kind of like takes some of its charge away, or sort of like allows space for everything else to kind of shine. And I think like
Shine.
to shine. It's a beautiful thing.
It's the genre of empathy, isn't it? I mean, ultimately, it's the way we it's the way we share things that you would never share with another human being normally at all. It's like the most intimate transmission of your thoughts and feelings. I was going to talk about Black House though as well, like his collaborations, like that. I mean, for me, Black House is a real special. It's a collaboration with Peter Straub, isn't it? Yeah, and it's just I don't know who wrote which parts either.
I know Peter had to write that opening.
Right.
Flying from above. But other than that, you can't tell.
But even that aerial shot is so Stephen King, that kind of descending from above. Like, it's almost like they're channeling each other. And I think that I could not imagine working in collaboration with anyone. I don't play well like that. But but this seamless, amazing kind of to and fro between them is incredible. And that's a novel that's a comfort read for me, definitely.
Now, have you met Steve? Have any of you met Steve before?
No.
Or been to a signing or anything like that? So,
no.
What do you think it would be like? Obviously, Steve invites you to dinner. You would go, all hang out. Would it be like? People always ask me, well, Rich, when you met him at the beginning, what it was like? And I always say, well, you remember that Saturday Night Live with Chris Farley, with Paul McCartney, where he's like, so. You were in the Beatles. and just smiling at him, and I'm thinking, I hope it wasn't like that, but flip a coin, it probably was me, going, so you wrote Salem's Lot, and Pennywise, but I mean, wouldn't that be cool to hang out and have dinner and?
Yeah. Is he going to appear? Like, is this an Oprah moment? Is he going to?
I was going to say, are we about to?
I know.
No,
That's
I
awesome.
wish.
No, I did an event when Black River Orchard came out. I did an event with Owen, and I was really amazed that he said yes. It was like, publisher's like, what about Owen King? I was like, sure. And they were like, no, he said yes already. And I was like, okay, that's amazing. So he's just lovely. And it took me, we ate weird apples, and he was having a good time with that. But the whole time I wanted to be like, I like your dad. I mean, you're great, but like, how's your dad? Is he here?
So I'm a big Joe Hill fan, and
Yeah.
I've been to Joe Hill signings, and he's also a big Trekkie, and even like had like Star Trek actors like do his audiobooks. So I've definitely done that. But I happen to know right now, actually, I think my book made its way into the King House this week. And it may or probably won't ever get read, but it did. It got in the door. I don't know. I mean, I want to get to the bottom of one thing, like one alleged story, which is about the Ramones and Pet Sematary, because there's this whole story about like that he invited them up to his house, and then like one of them went to the basement and then came back upstairs, and the song Pet Sematary was written, but then like the story was refuted. I don't know. That's what I really want to know.
You want confirmation?
Yeah, I want to know what happened there. Pet Sematary, but that's like a whole.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
I can't believe no one's mentioned
Ooh.
that. Yeah.
So good.
The thing is, like, right, I just know no matter what happened, I would do or say something that would keep me awake for the rest of my life. I just would. That's the way these things go. No matter how cool I was, the last minute I'd vomit on him or something. I just know I would. So as much as I desire it, I also fear it. But Stephen King changed my life. Like Stephen King's with his support of The Last House on Needle Street. My first two books, fine. The second one, I might as well have written it and thrown it straight into the toilet. It did so badly. It sold minus copies its first year out. I didn't even know that was possible. So with my third book, and suddenly basically out of nowhere, on Twitter, I'll never be rude about social media again, there's support from Stephen King. And it genuinely changed my career and my life. And I would like to say that's something that's part of the horror community that I really appreciate, which is we look out for each other. And that it really is a community. And also, Stephen King doesn't need to do anything. He can sunbathe for the rest of his life if he wants to. But, you know, he puts the ladder back down. He's a passionate advocate for the genre and he continues to engage in it. And I think that is something that I really appreciate.
Yeah, I find myself sometimes, you know, sticking up for him, and A, because he's my friend, B, because of what you just said. It's like Steve doesn't need to do any of this.
He doesn't.
He doesn't need to stick his neck out on the line politically, say the things that he says. He certainly doesn't need to take the time to get on his phone, actually on his iPad, and tweet about these books. CJ, he'll read your book. It might be next week, it might be next year, but
that is like probably my number one dream in my entire life.
Yeah.
So
It is actually
big deal.
it is my number one nightmare. He's going to read one of mine because I'm like, I'll be the first one. He's like, meh, like didn't like that one. I'm like, no, I'm better off not knowing.
But yeah, I just, you know, like I said, I've taken some heat before, you know, they're like, you're King's whipping boy. I'm like, well, I got like 15 friends in my life. He's one of them. So you know what? I'm going to stick up for him.
That sounds
publicly.
okay.
Yeah. And he's got a cool family. I've never met Joe. I've met Owen a couple times. I'm getting my ass kicked in Owen's fantasy football league. I actually won it once. I've been in this league for like 5 or 6 years, and I did win it once. You get a trophy.
Yeah.
I broke the trophy. Had to fix the trophy. It was like an episode of the Brady Bunch or something. I'm like, I have to glue this back together, and I'm not telling anyone. And then if it shows up broke, then the postman did it. It happened in the mail. But yeah, those are the coolest things. Is, you know, Steve does a March Madness basketball, NCAA basketball thing, and I've never come close to winning that. And it's the Chuck Farrell honorary tournament now, named after Chuck, who passed away last year, his editor and agent. But I mean, I'm picturing all of us at dinner with him, and you guys would love him because he's laid back. I mean, he'd be there in his jeans, be falling off, and he'd be wearing a T-shirt, and he'd be, you know, he's just a normal guy, and you'd forget until, well, you might not. If you vomit on him, you might not. But yeah, it doesn't take long for the, you know, you were in the Beatles whole thing, or like to go away. But it's. I wish I could drag him out here. I did text him from the stairway when I took that video, and I said, "They're all here to talk about you," and he's like, "Isn't that nice?" I said, "Yeah," until I start talking, and they all leave. But yeah, I mean, I guess when I think about him, and I think, by the way, did you take writing classes, Chuck?
Like in college?
Yeah. Like these guys. Yeah. On the way here, I'm thinking, man, I'm the worst writer on this damn stage tonight. And no wonder you all got educated. I learned from reading comic books and King. So
It's probably more useful than being argued about for like whether you had a right to be there. I don't know, like the comic books.
Yeah, well, you know what? Me in a class I probably would have lost my mind though, because you have to be like you said, you can't talk.
You can't talk. You can't talk. And for 2 hours, it's like torture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I've got like thick skin, so if like I'm reading something I wrote and they want to laugh, they can. I don't even care. But yeah, I'd probably get in trouble for laughing at other people.
I mean, you joke though, like the education part of like, you know, writing classes. I think the education did begin when we started reading, and probably in this case, you start reading things like Stephen King and other comic books and other things. That's where it starts. I mean, then sometimes the writing classes try to knock that out of you, and you have to hold on to it because they really do try to claw it out sometimes.
I had a similar. So I was in school 2016 to 2018. I did my master's program. And like, in case anybody here needs to hear this, there's no world in which anyone needs a master's program to become a professional fiction writer.
Really not.
It is not a thing you need. But I did it. And it was so funny because it was that same, I was working on a vampire trucker novel at that time, and it was like, oh, the vampire book. Like, we're now going to workshop the vampire book. And I remember people taking me aside and saying, yeah, but it's like horror. You know, as if to say, this will never, ever sell. And they were right for a lot of years. And then... So I don't know. I think, and by the way, sidebar soapbox here, but I've been hearing this phrase lately about horror, like having a moment.
Yeah, it's never gone away.
Yeah, not only has it never gone away, but like romance, sci-fi, fantasy, thrillers, like mysteries, all of those are all the time. We have shelves for all of those in every bookstore on the planet. I think it's just like now, it was Stephen King for a long time. I think the rest of us are here, and I think we're not going anywhere. And I think it's honestly probably because largely of him. So it's a cool time to be alive.
So we only have a few minutes left, and this is another one of the. You hand me a mic, you never know what's going to happen. So I'm just curious. First of all, tell us a little bit about the current book, but also I'm curious, what if you weren't a writer right now? Because I feel like all four of us are pretty damn grateful that we get to do this for a living. I know I am, and I've read your personal comments online and that kind of thing, and read all of your work, and it seems like you celebrate it as well. But what else? What do you think you would be doing if you weren't a writer?
I would die.
Yeah.
I think
I would just deliquesce into the earth.
That was it.
I have none. I mean, I've been doing this for long enough now. Like, I have no other skills. So maybe like an editor, but I feel like that's cheating the question a little bit. So I just choose deaf.
I think I could be like a pilot or like a trucker.
A doctor.
Just like be alone. I don't know, but a pilot, you have to have a buddy. So, a trucker.
A license?
Yeah, I think it'd be cool. I think it'd be cool just to be like in a truck with my dogs and not talk to anyone. And just kind of like see the road and think, which is kind of like what our job is. And then we just write it down.
Yeah.
So maybe that's a cheat.
I was an actor for a while. I was so unbelievably unsuccessful. I can't describe to you. No, I mean, really. Like, it was like the acting equivalent of selling -5 copies a year. But I think the storytelling thing kind of, that's what it was really about. So when I pivoted, there was a bit, but I wouldn't do that now. My God, no. I think I'll go with Chuck, I'd just die.
You vomited on the director,
I'd
didn't
vomit
you?
and die.
Yeah. I would be, I guess, a 58-year-old center fielder for the Baltimore Orioles. I know, honestly, I don't know what else I would do because I'm not very good at doing it.
Trained for nothing.
I can't fix things. I still can't, like fix the remote control. It's like my son's like, "Hey, Dad, it's batteries." I'm like, "Yeah, well, the ones I had wouldn't fit." So. But yeah, it's just neat. It's neat when you meet people who are because I have met a few writers, and you guys are all too young, but I've met particularly some older writers who have kind of lost that luster off the job. And you know what? Considering the state of the publishing world at times, I understand. It's certainly not always fair. But I wake up every day and kind of still have to pinch myself and say, someone pays me to do this. This is like robbing, the 7-Eleven down the street from my house. Very, very, very grateful.
All right, folks, we are going to switch over to audience Q&A. I do not have a fifth microphone, so we either need you to be really, really loud, or I can repeat your questions. So, starting, please raise your hands, and I will come find you.
Oh, that's rough.
Oh, no.
That's a nasty shock.
I'm short, so there's not much you can see. So I actually teach a horror writing class at Bloomsburg University about an hour and a half from here. So I, of course, want to tell my students on Monday that I was here, and I would love to know what advice do you have for budding horror writers?
My advice is I answered this on a podcast yesterday, and I said, I'm like, well, I'm not really smart enough to give a lot of advice, but the best advice I give is just get to the point where you write the end on something.
Yeah.
For people ask me all the time, well, why didn't you, write a novel when you were younger? And sometimes I'll skirt around and say, I was writing movies, I was writing short stories, the publishing company, which really did take all my time. But a big part of that truth is I couldn't get to the point on a novel where I wrote the end. I was trying to be too perfect. I was trying to reinvent the wheel. I was, not really the insecurities, but just the inadequacies of myself as a writer at that time. And what I've realized over time is get to the end, write that thing, get it down, no matter how sloppy it is, no matter how nonsensical it is, because wonderful things happen in the rewriting process. That's where the magic happens, I think, at least for me, where I can connect something on page 50 and page 250, and, if all goes right 2 years down the road, a reviewer is talking about how clever I am for doing that, and I just, I can kind of snicker and say, total happy accident. Whether it was my subconscious or whether I just got lucky, those things, I was able to write a half a page on page 175, and it connected them seamlessly. Those things happen in rewriting. So that's the biggest advice I can get, is just get it done, get it finished. And then the only other thing is people sometimes will say to me, in writing classes, I have a hard time getting started. And what I always say is journal, because what you'll find is if you're journaling about your life or your friends' lives or your family's lives, a lot of times that will spill over and become a story.
In particular for the horror, I think a really good way to start generating ideas is think about the thing you love most or the place you feel safest, and then think about how it could hurt you. That's kind of what horror is. So that's my little that's a little window into me.
And that's nightmare fuel for the night,
I would say it sounds so cliche, but they can't stop. If they want it, keep going. I was sending books out for 7 years before any agent said yes to me, and that was fast, by this industry's terms. So I think if you love it, if you care about it, just show up and do it and don't stop.
To build off Kat's point, sort of about the writing horror specifically, I think there is value in writing about the things that freak you out. It's an anxious time to be alive, and everybody's got their own special, house, artisanal anxieties. And I think it's really useful to write about those things because you're personally invested in them. You know them very well. Write what you know is bad advice, but there's a little bit of good advice, especially when it's tied to kind of the things you think and the things you feel and the things that scare you. So grabbing hold of those things and putting them on the page is not only a great way to deal with them. If you can't afford a therapist right now, hey, write a book, but also get a therapist. But then, just sort of grapple with that stuff. And then ultimately, storytelling is this weird exhortation against loneliness. We're all crying into the dark and we're trying to hear someone in the dark responding. And, I think that's what they can do with fiction.
Right over here.
Hi, thank you all for coming. One of the question I have is about when somebody does a screen adaptation of these books, and one of the things I've noticed through that is they tend to minimize the real horrors of life, like for example child abuse, and accentuate these fantasy horrors. And do you agree, and why do you think that is?
I'm trying to think of exact examples of what you're talking about. I know what you mean. I think
Do you mean in King books specifically?
King books specifically.
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
That's the very good. I just watched that, and it totally loses most of the book in favor of vampires, which I get because it's a big book and they only have 2 hours to tell the story, so they can't just tell the book about all the dark human stuff and be like, whoops, forgot the vampires. So they spend their budget on the vampires. And I think that's ultimately what it is. I think film industry, they like the glitz, the pizzazz, the effects. It's an easy sell, vampires.
Sell, yeah.
So
whereas the human suffering is a little more, a little less palatable, and harder to do on screen. Horror sits better, I think. I think we are, things are very different to how they were even a decade ago. But horror sits better with people if it is a kind of heightened, slightly almost pantomime-y kind of slightly schlocky edge, because that means you don't have to really be afraid. So I think maybe there may be an element of wanting to strip out the parts of horror that people don't feel are actually too horrible for people to actually deal with. I think that there may be that. People feel that these things don't run alongside each other, whereas I think they actually do. I think obviously human horror and supernatural horror are just two words for the same thing. So yeah, good question.
You know what did it quite well was Mike Flanagan's Dr. Sleep.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Has one of the most disturbing with the little boy. I mean, that scene, I couldn't sleep for so long, and even with the main storyline, I think that one really got it right.
Yeah.
That is an underrepresented novel
film.
and film. They're
Yeah.
so good.
Yeah.
I was going to say, it seems like there's only a very small handful of directors who are granted the freedom to make Stephen King films the way they want. I'm a two-time loser on that. I adapted with my buddy John Sheck From a Buick 8 and also Black House.
Wow.
From a Buick 8 came really close to being made. What happened is the money people, the investors, and the producers, they kept doing what you're saying here. Is they Buick 8 at its heart is a story about loss and faith and learning to accept. The line, there are Buicks everywhere, is essentially saying, hey, if you're always going to have answers in your life, it's going to be a frustrating experience, man, because that's what life is. There are Buicks everywhere. There are these unexplainable things. And for us, we wanted to make that film with monsters that come out of a trunk from another, realm, blah, 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 blah. But they just wanted more monsters. Where if Frank Darabont was directing that film, at that time, but you hear all the time now that Shawshank never, could not be made right now. They wouldn't have let him do it. Now Mike Flanagan seems to be the one who has kind of picked up Frank's power there. And I've heard nothing but good things about the life of Chuck, and there's no monsters. So.
All right, next question, right over here.
Thank you all again for coming. I guess, when you talk about writing a story or a novel and making sure you get to the end, I'm guessing there are a lot of ideas that you have that don't end up in that far. What is it about a certain idea that makes you go, well, this is something I really like? What makes some stick and some not?
What makes a laser pointer enticing to a cat? Because it's that, probably. I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Sometimes there's just, you're in a moment in your life. I have a book called The Book of Accidents, and I tried writing it 20 years ago, and it didn't work. And I tried writing it 10 years ago, and it didn't work. And then I tried writing it now, and it was the right time. The brownies inside me had baked completely, and it was time.
I think for me, it's like a very clear, very obsessive feeling that I'll internally start spinning around an idea and I can't think about anything else. And when I'm eating and when I'm talking to somebody and when I'm running and when I'm walking, that thing is moving. And I think if I get even an inkling of that antenna going up, I'm dropping everything now.
Well, I've only ever had 3 ideas. And I wrote them all. No, I discover by writing whether it's a Darwinian process. If you have to kick the tires and see if it works. And some of them, you're like, oh my God, this is going to change the. No, it's just no, it doesn't work. I think you discover in the writing of it. I think.
Yeah, for me, it's once I find those characters that inhabit the story. Then I can't. It won't let go of me. Where, like you said, there's going to be stories you start and you give up for proper reasons. For me, it's always fallen in love with the characters, and then they just kind of carry me away.
All right, right in front of y'all.
Hi, thank you. Judge a book by its cover, right? I'm looking at all the covers and how spines are now different. It's like a moment, right? That you're talking about that. How much control do you have over what you get to pick, and how much do you feel like people are actually going to catch your sales and just anything you can share about that, drawing the reader in, especially as people are collecting different editions. So much more these are treasures to display.
They are. Covers are incredibly different in different countries. You would not believe the difference between the UK and the US covers. As to how much control we get, if you really, really, really hate something, you got to really hate it. then you can say something. But otherwise, I think you just have to trust that they know their market, and everyone's intention is to draw the reader in and to sell books. That's everyone's goal. So, it can be, and I do, they know a lot more than we do, but I'm not sure they're not sort of. They're not looking into the future. They don't have the power to actually know, because the book industry is a sort of soothsaying, really, essentially. Everybody's just trying to guess what's going to happen next, and nobody knows. So it's just I think the best editors, I think this is a perfect, for Looking Glass Down, this is perfect, because this is kind of my love letter to Stephen King country. It's Maine, set in Maine, and it's about writers. Where do I get my idea? And so it's got that it's got that retro feeling to it, and it also is very reminiscent of King. And it's got, I remember asking them at the beginning, it looks a bit homemade, and they were like, that's the point. It's supposed to look like those kind of 80s covers. And I think that shows a real sensitivity to the book, and it gives you, a cover should invite you in and give you, and subliminally give you the knowledge of the book before you start reading the book. And I think this does that really well. Sometimes it's baffling, and I don't know what they're thinking, but you can never tell what's going to work. I don't know, what do you think, Siege?
I'm new here. This is my second book, and I think with these, this is a painter did these paintings in Connecticut, and then they kind of took them and adapted them to look like a book cover, and based on the books. And they were very specific, we want to do something a little bit different. And so I think we were very intentionally kind of stepping out of what we had seen. And so far it's been good, because mostly people will be like, oh, yours is that one with the eyeball on the cover. And so that has worked out. Now there are many with eyeballs on the cover, which I appreciate. But what I want to shout out here is something is happening right now that is very thrilling to me, which is gloss is returning. This is the look of my childhood. This is what I want everything to be. This is very thrilling to me. And that stuff, you are never told if it's matte, and there are, by the way, 5 kinds of matte and gloss and rough and velvet and all these terms they throw around. You're I don't know. I hope people like it. But probably the answer is, yeah, it does a lot for sales, and we're all just kind of hoping for the best.
Yes.
What they said, yeah.
Ditto.
What about you, Rich?
Yeah, no, I agree. I love that cover, and Simon Schuster's been great to me as far as they actually have given me. I think I had 5 or 6 different, kind of cover concepts to choose from this time. Chasing the Boogeyman, I'm still convinced that the cover is why it did as well as it did, because it kind of does meld true crime and horror suspense fiction, just in an eye blink. And then Becoming the Boogeyman, they actually use some clip art or something, but I still love it very much. But as soon as they announced it and they showed the book, I of course I had 3 or 4 readers send me, they used this cover on something else in 1999 or whatever. But yeah, I've been very fortunate. So.
Right over here. Hi, going back to Stephen King for a minute. I really loved the new collection that came out this year, and it made me want to ask you guys if you all have a Stephen King short story that stood out to you more than others.
Well, there's The Body.
Yeah, it's definitely.
Yeah, that's always going to be. I know it's more of a novella, but that's going to be my standout.
We mentioned Long Walk earlier, and that's really one that stuck with me. Even so that there's a tiny little thing that fed into one of my novels, Wanderers, about people walking. I'd say the first place my brain went to was that.
They're cheating, by the way, because those are both novellas, aren't they?
Oh,
yeah,
shit.
Cheaters. Is it called A Good Marriage? Is that one? Did I just pull that out of... Somebody tell me if I just made that up. But the other one is Gingerbread Girl. Has anybody read that? It's basically The Long Walk, but running. It's very good. Very good.
For me, it was The Monkey. I and I've told this story a lot, but 10th grade, my English teacher, Richard Gallagher, brought in photocopies of The Monkey. And, you know, if anyone knows about the original publication, it was published in Gallery magazine, which is like this smutty magazine, in a cool little chapbook, a little pull-out chapbook. And he broke like 50 different rules for a sophomore class, English class in a public high school. Brought in photocopies. We took turns reading it aloud in class. And, you know, in the beginning, everyone's giggling because there's like cuss words, get to read fart out loud. And, but by the end, everyone is just stone silent, because they're scared, you know, out of their. And I remember, I mean, for me, again, I've said it a lot, but for me, it was like it opened the door. And by the time we were finished that story, I'm like, okay, I know what I want to do.
All right. I have one final question over here that I will be announcing for the questionnaire. So what are your guys' thoughts on the pseudonym Richard Bachman and Stephen King's writing under that pseudonym? Alongside, what are your thoughts on, personally, pseudonyms for yourself?
I mean, the Bachman stuff was cool, and I loved that it had a narrative around it. Like, it was itself a story, like, in a murder, and then having to kill him, and then... So, I mean, I think that was both cool in terms of, like, separating, you know, books and fiction from itself, but then also drawing attention to it in a really unique way. Pseudonyms, I tried to use one for my middle grade works because I'm like, I don't want kids to know that I write this other stuff. But then the middle grade publisher was like, yeah, but the reason we're letting you publish middle grade is because you have these adult books. And I was like, right, but they don't care. The kids don't care. They're going to find my blog and I use bad words there. It's not good. Please don't do it. And they're like, no, it's your name on this cover, buddy. And so thankfully, I've never had a kid be like, oh my God, I've read horrible things. So we seem all right, but I wanted to do it and they wouldn't let me.
It never occurred to me to use like any kind of pen name, and I felt very so proud when I finally did sell a book that I really wanted to see my name on it. I think now there might have been advantages to using a pen name because folks can have very strong reactions to books across the board. Like, any emotion you can think of, that there's a person who is feeling that to the 1000th degree, which is very cool. But yeah, sometimes I'm like, oh man, like Chuck Tingle really knows what's up. But as far as Richard Bachman goes, I mean, I just think it's cool that we have access to all of that. Anne Rice wrote under something Roquelaure. Yeah, great books. Those were her erotic novels. But I think it's cool when we know and we can kind of make the connections, and I can understand wanting to differentiate.
Yeah, I love the idea of a writerly identity being, part of your style, and indicating a certain part of your style being explicitly summoned. Back in the days when I was selling -5 books a year, I was recommended to change my name. I'm really glad that I didn't, because I'm really proud of what I've written, whether it was thrown down the toilet or not. I think it would have felt wrong to have pivoted for that reason. I think using a pen name in the way to express different sides of your writerly self is a fantastic idea. I don't think it would have been a good idea to do it out of duress. I would have felt wrong.
I love the fact that, these Bachman books exist. I love the fact that he pulled the wool over people's eyes. I wish I had known him back then, so I could have, threatened him and been like, Fenway tickets tonight, or I'm spilling the beans. But I think I was probably, in middle school. And, yeah, there's not, enough demand out there for my work to ever have to use a pseudonym, so you're stuck with Chizmar on my books.
Do you think we'll ever get another Richard Bachman? I think we will too, yeah. Me too. Yeah.
I think there's probably a couple in the drawer right now, which pisses me off. So.
All right.
All right. On that note, everyone, let's give one last round of applause.
Would you guys mind if we did a big selfie with you all? Would that be okay? Yeah?
Okay, I think I can do this.
Yeah, you want to do this?
My
Okay.
time to shine.
Now's your time to shine.